It's difficult to overstate just how important Final Fantasy VII was to the success of the original PlayStation, the viability of both the Final Fantasy series and JRPGs in general in the West, and my own personal video game history. Cast your minds back to the year 1996. We lived in a world where it was increasingly unlikely that classic JRPGs would be localized for Western audiences. Of the first 6 Final Fantasy games, only 3 released in North America. Even fewer of those came out in Europe. Think of all the classic Super Nintendo RPGs, and odds are they didn't come out in Europe in their original release. All-time classics like Super Mario RPG, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, they just weren't released here. JRPGs were an obscure niche that publishers didn't feel were worth putting the time and resources into releasing in Western markets. Whether they thought the games were too hard or lacked mainstream appeal, we were left without many of the defining games of those systems. That was the world we lived in, a world where some of the greatest games of all time simply couldn't be played. Bleak. That all changed with Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII was a blockbuster. A big, bold, ambitious, weird game. And boy are we going to get into the wonderful, wacky vein of weirdness that runs through this game. While Final Fantasy VI was impressive for its storytelling depth, the SNES simply didn't have the horsepower to render the game's vision. The technological jump to PS1 was a game changer. While I would personally argue the pixel art of 6 is more timeless than the blocky polygons of 7, that technical jump allowed 7 to wow at the time. As silly as it is to say about the goofy, awkward shapes of Final Fantasy VII, that game looked in 1997 what the remake looks like today. Try to put that in perspective when you look back on this game. It looked then what most impressive games look like now. It took the 2D SNES games and gave them the breadth and scope of 3D, and in the process took both the genre and the series mainstream. So with the remake coming out on April 10th, I figured I'd take a look back at what made Final Fantasy VII so special, and whether it still holds up with modern eyes. Fair warning, if you haven't played the original, spoilers will be plentiful, so if you'd like to go into the remake completely, blissfully unaware of the original, now's your chance to back out. We'll be going deep into the nitty-gritty of this game, like how Cloud pushes the down button on the elevator, but it still goes up, or how Avalanche seemingly hold their big terrorism planning meetings in the middle of a public train station. Or asking, where does Eris' mom sleep in this 2-bedroom house when Cloud sleeps over? Or how this guy, studying for soldier, lives in a house filled with performance-enhancing drugs. Or does anybody call the kid on the Chocobo farm out for exploiting the giant snake for profit? Did he put the snake there? Does the Midgar Zolom get a cut for driving so many customers to his Chocobo business? These are the clear, important, meaningful questions we'll be asking in Final Fantasy VII. So let's get to it. When you ask yourself the question, what is Final Fantasy VII actually about? There is one very clear answer. One simple theme is core to every story the game has to tell: environmental stewardship. The game is, after all, about a group of eco-terrorists who attempt to stop the evil corporation turned government called Shinra from taking over the planet and sucking all of its natural resources dry. This was remarkably ahead of its time in 1997. While we were certainly aware of climate change in the 90s, it wasn't yet seen as the global crisis that it is now, at least not as urgently. Games certainly had stories prior to Final Fantasy VII, but they were generally more simple, abstract good versus evil tales. Final Fantasy VII not only had a clear, central thesis that we are responsible for the long-term health of our planet, humans and the planet have a symbiotic relationship where caring for the long-term health of one cares for the long-term health of the other, but it even explores it with a remarkable degree of nuance and depth. Multiple times Barrett is either challenged on or himself questions whether the cost of what he's doing is worth it. Whether the deaths of his friends Biggs, Wedge and Jesse, as well as the collateral damage of his actions, are worthwhile in the pursuit of his goals. Whether there's a potential way to achieve environmental sustainability with a smaller body count. Equally, they were far ahead of the time capturing the tenor of the overall climate debate. There's a moment where Barrett passionately pleads with Cloud to care about their mission on a level above simply how much he's going to get paid, and Cloud simply responds, "Not my problem." I would be impressed with a game that came out in 2020 that had such a strong stance on environmental protection, never mind one that came out in 1997. This game probably informed my own opinions on climate and the planet more than I probably realized at the time. As for the rest of the story, it's probably easiest if we go through character by character. The strength of the game is in the strength of the characters. Nearly all of the main cast gets moments to shine, and moments of important character growth or narrative resolution that makes the whole journey feel complete. Katesid kinda sucks. On the surface, the idea that a high-ranking Shinra executive is working alongside, and against, your team is cool. Not to mention, a remote-controlled cat shouting orders to a large stuffed Moogle via megaphone is objectively hilarious. But the game sort of rushes past the fact that Katesid threatens to harm a child, so you allow him to stay with you after he openly betrays you. That's pretty darn crappy. They do try to redeem him a little with his sacrifice in the Temple of the Ancients, plus he turns the tables and spies on Shinra in the back half of the game, but every time I play through, I like him less. He does predict Eris' death though, at least he has that going for him. Yuffie isn't the deepest character of the bunch. She loves materia and gets horribly motion sick, but she is consistent welcome comic relief. The dance you have to play with her to even unlock her, without her robbing you and running away, is one of my favourite ways to unlock a character ever. And the fact that Wutai as a city is nearly entirely devoted to her character-specific side quest shows how much they wanted to flesh out these characters. She always pops up in fun ways, like in Costa del Sol selling items, how she immediately doesn't trust Katesid, or how after failing to steal your materia, Yuffie then tries to get you to sign a legally binding agreement that gives it to her after you save the world. Impressive hustle. Vincent was my favourite character as a kid. I would have first played Final Fantasy VII when I was 7 or 8, and the weird emo dude with a shotgun who turned into a kick-ass monster for his limit break was the absolute coolest thing on earth to me. Not to mention the added mystique of him being an optional character that I didn't discover until my second playthrough of the game. That added a whole other layer to it. What other secrets were waiting for me in this game? Vincent's side story isn't the longest in the world, but it offers you some pretty vital backstory. While Hojo mentions that he is Sephiroth's father during the return to Midgar, it's not until you meet Lucretia that you understand exactly what happened. Without that, it feels like a shock revelation that never really goes anywhere. Plus, his emo poetry rocks. Cid is the grizzled veteran of the group. Well, actually at 32, he's 3 years younger than Barrett, but still. Foul-mouthed and angry at the world for not being allowed to fulfill his dreams. Cid probably has the simplest and most satisfying arc in the game. After his ambitions of travelling to space are ruined by Shira's diligence, he lives out his days in Rocket Town, bitterly begrudging the relic of his failures that constantly hovers above him. That rocket stands there over him day and night, an ever-present reminder of his unfulfilled potential. Both Cid and Shira get redeemed. Cid finally gets to go to space, and Shira, who is subject to really horrible abuse by Cid, was right all along about the faults in the rocket. Not to mention, his ridiculous over-the-top run is the best animation in the game. It's so perfectly Cid. I also love how the game throws sass at you for definitely looking up the code to the huge materia while in space. The game knows. Red 13 is a very strange character because on the one hand he's a talking dog, but on the other he's generally a more reserved, self-serious character. He, along with frankly the Final Fantasy series in general, helped teach me Roman numerals as a kid. He goes from dramatically and earnestly shouting halt to desperately struggling to walk on his hind legs. He's basically a moody teenager. He does have the most emotional non-death related moment of the game, as his discovery that his father was not the coward he believed, but rather a hero who saved Cosmo Canyon from an invading tribe, lands as one of the most emotionally resonant moments in the game. Nanaki's a good boy. Eris. Man, what can be said about Eris? Look, I know it should be Aerith, and will be Aerith in the remake, but listen, I'm a stickler for the original text. Mistranslated or otherwise. And I'm probably mispronouncing names left, right, and centre here anyway. Eris' death still holds up as one of the most important and memorable moments not just in the Final Fantasy series, but in all of video games. She wasn't the first major Final Fantasy character to be killed off. Tella in Final Fantasy IV and Galuf in Final Fantasy V both bit the dust too. But Eris' lands with so much more impact. Everything about the moment, from the framing to Eris' peaceful serenity to the music. Oh man, the music. It's all perfect. Even the way the music carries over into the subsequent boss fight against Genova adds to the weight of it all. The immediate and sudden mourning doesn't go away even during a boss fight. Eris was such an easily likeable, charming character, and her death comes so suddenly in the narrative that it's a complete shock to the system. Death aside, Eris sees through Cloud and understands that the face he puts on is not his own. It helps a great deal that she dated the dude that Cloud basically assumed the identity of. In my playthrough to get footage for this, I got Eris for the Golden Saucer date, this in spite of me being a jerk to her and not buying a flower. Come on, Final Fantasy VII. Whatever calculation you use to decide who goes on that date is clearly broken. I wanted Barrett. Knowing what's to come shortly after adds a real poignancy to that moment playing through it again. Nothing that Eris wants to see or do comes to pass. She never got to ride the high wind. She did save the world though. I guess that evens out. Barrett is in many ways the heart and soul of the game, the emotional core, the driving force behind the overall environmental message. His parenting skills are somewhat questionable. He tends to leave his adopted child to run a bar, and then leaves her with relative strangers while he goes to save the world. But his heart's in the right place. His desperate need to save the planet is rooted in his own mistakes. He learned just how misplaced any trust in Shinra was, and paid a great price. He lost his wife, his arm, his home, and his best friend. He needs some way to atone for all that guilt. He is not, however, so blinded by his desire to save the planet that he does not recognize the cost of his actions. It haunts him. What if he's repeating the mistakes of the past? It's easy to allow Barrett to descend into caricature. He's occasionally played for the clueless dope who has no idea what's going on, or as the aggressive loudmouth. But under the surface, he's probably the most interesting and nuanced character in the game. He should also feel absolutely no shame at how much he likes his sailor outfit. He's adorable. It's unfortunate that Tifa is predominantly defined by her relationship to Cloud. She doesn't really get much, if any, individual standout moments that are hers and hers alone. Rather, any development of Tifa is done side by side with Cloud. On the bright side, she does play an interesting role in that story, though unfortunately that means there's not too much to say about her in isolation. Cloud is a really interesting character. At first you think you have him pegged. He's every arrogant, distant, too cool for school, cocky lead you've ever seen. Broody and angsty, you think there's nothing there. Then you learn that Cloud is batshit crazy. Everything he projects is a facade to hide the fact that he is a broken husk of a human being. He's been stabbed, tortured, experimented on and poisoned. His only friend was brutally murdered trying to protect him. His life has been a series of depressing failures followed by brutal punishments. Every element of what used to be him has been stripped away, and the only way he can hold himself together, the only thing that can keep him from descending into a life of misery and despair, is to pretend to be someone else. The worst thing is the motivating factor behind it all. He just wanted to impress a girl. He just wanted Tifa to notice him. So he tried to become a soldier first class, and he failed. I relate so hard with Cloud's inability to let those he used to know and care for see his true self, see how he had not achieved anything he set out to. It's so simple and so human. It's heartbreaking. Tifa knows that Cloud is super duper messed up from the start, so she keeps an eye on him the whole time. It's really sweet, though clearly there came a point where she should have sat him down and worked it out earlier. You know, when the dude gives the black materia to the evil bad guy, maybe then start filling in the gaps. The way they tell the Nibelheim backstory, let you know most of it is bullshit in the middle of the game, and then make things clear at the end works really well. It's a satisfying narrative puzzle to watch work itself out. They do a good job of planting the seeds that Tifa knows there's something wrong with him, but she's not ready to confront him about it. Even though the game stops for about 20 minutes when Cloud and Tifa enter the livestream to work everything out, it feels earned. About time poor Cloud is put back together. And when you see the secret cutscene in Shinra Mansion after that, it's really tragic to see the warm-hearted and kind Zack shot down while helping Cloud. Cloud is more of a puzzle to be solved than a truly unique character. We spend very little time with the actual Cloud at the end of the game, but it's a puzzle worth solving. Then there's Sephiroth. Part of the reason this game became so memorable is Sephiroth instantly became one of the most recognizable video game villains ever. Look up nearly any ranking of video game villains and you'll see Sephiroth on it. The shot of Sephiroth standing in a burning Nibelheim was one of the game's key pieces of art, one of its truly iconic images. The relationship between Jenova and Sephiroth is interesting to explore because technically what you see for most of the game is parts of Jenova controlled by Sephiroth, rather than Zephyr himself. They only give you passing glimpses at the long-term lore of the world, explaining the ancients and their war with Jenova. I wanted so much more of that. There is a fun question of whether Jenova is in control all along. Jenova is a parasite after all, but the game does side firmly with a Zephyr master plan. And that master plan being destroy the world, then become one with the world, and become the world. Solid. Zephyr the man, driven mad by his greater and incorrect understanding of where he comes from, was already hyper-confident before developing a full-on god complex. After that, he becomes your standard destroy-the-world villain, but the vulnerability that led him there is what makes him interesting. The rest is carried by super character design, fantastic iconography, and really amazing music. That's more or less the story and characters covered, so what about the gameplay? Final Fantasy VII does a really good job of disguising the fact that it's a pretty by-the-numbers RPG formula. The same town, overworld, dungeons pattern you saw throughout the earlier games in the series was broadly repeated here. Even with the same progressive vehicles going from buggy to boat to airship to submarine. There are some clear more traditional dungeons like the Mithril Mines or the Nibelheim Mountains, but generally the game dresses them up to the extent that they don't feel as rote and routine as earlier games. Longer dungeons like the Great Glacier or the Temple of the Ancients all look and feel unique with their own ideas and puzzles. Equally, the game moves you from big set piece to big set piece so swiftly that no place or location overstays its welcome. Outside of the initial Midgard section, the longest part of the game that feels like one area is the Icicle Inn, Great Glacier, and Northern Crater portion of the game. And even then, that's separated into clear different areas. Even in the back half of Disc 2 as you return to areas like Coral or Rocket Town, the game ramps up the stakes and the drama with runaway train heists or a trip to space. It's an incredibly well-designed and well-paced world. The game is a turn-based RPG. There is nothing particularly surprising from a gameplay perspective. You choose 3 of up to 9 playable characters at any given time, and then you choose options from a menu. It feels weird explaining a turn-based RPG. Each character has their own set of weapons and their own limit breaks, ultimate attacks that you can unleash after a meter fills after taking damage. Final Fantasy VII's big addition to the series is the materia system. Each weapon or armor has a certain number of materia slots allowing you to equip spells, support magic, or summons. There's always a balance with RPGs where you want to allow players to customize the characters, but equally, you want the characters to feel different and unique. I think this strikes that balance. Plus, leveling up materia means that some of the lower level characters remain viable. You just have to move the materia builds onto them. It's a nice, tidy, simple system. Not to mention, all these summon animations are really superb. The world of Final Fantasy may be the true standout. The game talks a lot about how bad Shinra is and how the life is slowly being sucked from the planet, but the game also shows you the effect it's having. Every time you go to a new area, you see the devastating effects Shinra has had on the world. Whether it be the sorry remains of Coral after Shinra burned the town to the ground, the brutal and devastated village of Gongaga after their reactor exploded, the fact that the areas of Midgar have long since forgotten their true names, the once proud Wutai being reduced to a tacky tourist trap, Nibelheim becoming a fake town filled with actors, which, by the way, if you're going to do that, maybe don't leave letters that admit it out in the open to be found by anybody. All throughout the game there is a sense of melancholy. The cost of Shinra's oppression is clearly evident. The towns feel lived in, they feel fully featured. It's not just the old school RPG setup where a town is little more than a place to heal and buy items. Everything and everybody feels fully fleshed out. Even the nameless, faceless members of the Highwind crew are given personalities and backstories. The world of Final Fantasy VII from Midgar on down feels like a complete place with its own sad, brutal history. Final Fantasy VII is also brilliantly, unabashedly weird. Strangeness is built into the DNA of the game. It's central to every quirky interaction. Whether it's the weird fainting people in Midgar, the creepy dude that stalks you in Coral Prison, everything that is Don Corneo, everything that is Wall Market, and most certainly everything that is the Honeybee Inn. Whether it's the absolutely fantastic sequence climbing the endless staircase in Shinra Tower, the enemy that's just a weaponized house, the dude that gets blown away by a helicopter in Costa del Sol, the fact that sadness is an actual status effect, the game was clearly way ahead of its time on the importance of maintaining your mental health. Literally everything about the love-hate relationship the Turks have with you. The Turks were also the coolest characters in the world when I was a kid. The fact that the game weirdly allows you to open the door on so many people going to the toilet, only to finally build to the payoff of you getting punched in the face for it. The game revels in being offbeat, it lives in its weirdness, it makes it a defining feature. There is one area where Final Fantasy VII truly stands head and shoulders above the pack. One area where it seeks to excel so thoroughly that you can't help but commend it. Final Fantasy VII has so many mini-games. There is nothing FF7 loves more than a good mini-game. There is obviously the Golden Saucer, which is minigame capital of the world, but even outside of that, it's minigames, minigames, minigames. Before we talk about the bigger ones, let's just run through them. There's the barrel dropping minigame, the squats minigame, the CPR on a small child minigame, the standing in formation in a line minigame, the posing minigame, the Moogle sex simulator minigame, the chocobo racing and chocobo breeding minigames, the safe opening minigame. Literally everything in the Temple of the Ancients is a minigame. The dodging Elena's punch minigame, the escape from execution minigame, the don't crash a runaway train minigame, the flying endlessly into weapon to annoy Sid minigame. Alright, that's not a real one, but still, it's my favourite. Not all those minigames are created equal, but I'll be damned if they didn't swing for the fences. Then there's the big four, minigames so ambitious that you're like, how the hell did you put this in a regular RPG? The motorcycle chase is such a fun little diversion that I'm kinda mad there aren't more of them in the game, or at least more levels in the Gold Saucer version. The Fort Condor minigame is basically a full, real-time strategy RPG inside of Final Fantasy VII. Again, it's not the deepest in the world, I usually won with the immaculate strategy of setting up 3 tumbling rocks and waiting, but it's crazy that it's even in there. Then there are the lesser two, but still pretty admirably different, the snowboarding minigame and the submarine battling minigame, both solid but nothing special. And then, of course, there's the most important minigame in the history of video games, not just Final Fantasy. The slap fight on the end of a cannon minigame, which is wonderful and dumb and absurd in all of the best ways. I don't think I've said the words minigame more in my life. So that brings us to the final question. Does Final Fantasy VII hold up? That's really hard for me personally to say. This was probably the most important game of my childhood. The first fictional world to truly hook me, even if I probably didn't understand why back then. I know it far too well to examine it with fresh eyes. Its music, the absolutely majestic soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu, that so wonderfully captures the mood and the tone of every scene, instantly transports me back to playing this game for the first time. Some of the writing has aged very, very badly, and there is no doubt that some of the triggers for the next events are somewhat obtuse. I remember running around Wutai for ages wondering what to do next the first time I played it. Also, the back half of Disc 2 loses some momentum. I still don't understand why they were so opposed to Shinra trying to blow up a meteor with a huge materia. They try to justify it with talk about how important that materia is to the planet, but it feels like narrative filler as Cloud loses his mind. I would have thought saving the planet is more important than some materia, but maybe it's just a moral objection to Shinra doing literally anything. It can feel a little slow by modern standards, but that can be rectified with the 3x speed up option on re-releases. But the spirit of what the game is holds up. The difficulty level is well paced and doesn't really need grinding, but equally, you never really become overpowered unless you grind. The story and themes are honestly more relevant in 2020 than they were in 1997. The personality and weirdness give the game a unique identity, and the characters remain memorable and likable. As the third best-selling game on PS1, it helped establish Sony as a console player, it turned the Final Fantasy series into a household name, and it still stands today as one of the most important games of all time. As the remake rapidly approaches, I only hope for one thing. The spirit of the original isn't lost. That its weird and peculiar sense of personality remains even despite the revamped combat, stunning visuals, and chapter-based release structure. I'm still all in on the remake though. As Barrett always says, there ain't no getting off of this train. thank you so much for watching. I hope I did Final Fantasy VII some degree of justice. It's one of my favorite games of all time. It's one of the most important games of all time to me, and hopefully the remake will equally do it justice. I'm looking forward to playing it this Friday. If you like this video, you can leave a like. If you really liked it, you could subscribe. I'd appreciate that. I put a lot of time into this one. You can follow me on Twitter at GarrettKidneyGA or ETTKIDNEY. On your left, my review of Final Fantasy VIII. On your right, why the Black Mage Village in Final Fantasy IX is one of my favorite towns in video game history. Thanks for watching.